The stagecoach wheel cracked clean in half on the outskirts of Harlan's Creek, and that was how Maude Bishop arrived in the worst town she had ever seen, sideways, rattled and furious. She had not planned on Harlan's Creek. Nobody planned on Harlan's Creek. The town sat in the flat basin of southeastern Colorado like something the earth had coughed up and forgotten. A cluster of sun-bleached buildings pressed against a horizon so wide and unforgiving that the sky seemed to lean down and crush everything beneath it. The year was 1878, and the frontier was alive in the worst possible ways, dusty, lawless, and absolutely indifferent to the plans of a woman who had just spent the last 3 months performing on a traveling variety stage across Kansas and Missouri. Maude was 26 years old, dark-haired, with sharp green eyes that could pin a man to the back wall of any saloon hall from 30 feet away. She had been a singer, a dancer, a comedienne, and occasionally a juggler when the troupe needed a fourth act. She had not been famous, but she had been good, and goodness in the variety circuit was its own kind of currency. She had been heading for Denver, where a man named Harold Finch had promised her a 6-month contract at the Golden Palace Theater, a real theater with a real stage and real curtains that didn't smell like mildew and regret. The contract was folded inside the inner pocket of her traveling coat, alongside a letter from her older sister in St. Louis, and a photograph of her mother that she carried everywhere. She had exactly $11.40 in her coin purse. She had a trunk of stage costumes, a hat box, and a temper that had only been made worse by 4 days of rough road and the company of a mail courier who snored like a dying ox. When the wheel gave out, the coach listed hard to the right and lurched to a grinding stop. The courier, a heavy-set man named Pell, tumbled out of his seat and into the dust. Maude gripped the window frame and managed not to fall, though her hat box did not share her luck. She climbed out with as much dignity as she could assemble and stood in the road looking at the broken wheel with the specific kind of fury that comes when a bad thing happens on top of many other bad things. "Well," said the driver from his perch, a wiry old man named Amos who had said almost nothing for 4 days, "looks like Harlan's Creek." "I can see that," Maude said tightly. "Can it be fixed?" "Needs a new wheel rim." "Could take a day, could take 2. I have a contract deadline in Denver." Amos shrugged with the profound indifference of a man who had driven coaches for 30 years and had learned that nobody's deadline was the road's problem. Maude picked up her hat box from the dust, straightened the brim of her traveling hat, and turned to look at Harlan's Creek. What she saw was a main street about 300 yards long with a general store, a livery, a sheriff's office with a broken shutter, 2 saloons, one called the Rusty Spur and one with no name painted on the sign, a barbershop, a boarding house with a hand-lettered card in the window, and at the far end, a building that appeared to have been a church and was now something else entirely, though she couldn't tell what from the road. There were maybe 30 or 40 people in sight. Most of them had already stopped what they were doing to look at her. Maude Bishop straightened her spine, tucked the hat box under her arm, and walked into Harlan's Creek like she owned it. The boarding house was run by a woman named Ida Plum, who was somewhere between 50 and 70, with iron-gray hair pinned in a knot so severe it seemed to stretch the skin around her temples. Ida looked Maude up and down, took in the stage costume peeking from the cracked hinge of the traveling trunk, and quoted her $1.50 a night with breakfast included. "I'll need 2 nights at most," Maude said. "Most folks who say that end up here a week," Ida said, not unkindly. "Rooms at the top of the stairs, left side. Suppers at 6 and not a moment later." Maude paid for 2 nights, hauled her own trunk up the narrow staircase, and stood in the small room looking out the window at the main street below. The room was clean, which surprised her. There was a white pitcher and basin, a narrow bed with a quilt in faded blue, and a hook on the back of the door. Outside, a dog was sleeping in the middle of the street. A pair of cowboys rode past without disturbing it. She washed her face, changed out of her traveling clothes into a simple gray dress, and told herself 2 days. Just 2 days, and she would be back on the road to Denver and the rest of her life. She went downstairs to find the nearest place that served food that wasn't Ida's supper, because it was only 3 in the afternoon, and her stomach had been making complaints since morning. Ida directed her to the general store, which also kept a small lunch counter in the back, run by a woman named Clara who made biscuits that Ida described as tolerable. The general store smelled of sawdust, coffee, and the particular sweetness of dried tobacco leaves. It was well stocked for such a small town: barrels of flour and salt, bolts of calico and muslin, canned goods on wooden shelves, a glass case near the counter with ribbons and thread and small notions. Maude found the lunch counter at the back and ordered a biscuit with butter and a cup of coffee. She was halfway through the biscuit, which was better than tolerable. Clara had undersold herself considerably, when the front door of the store opened and a man walked in. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, but lean in the way of men who worked with their bodies every day, and he was dusty from the road in a way that suggested he had ridden some distance. He wore a plain brown hat, a blue shirt that had been washed many times, and boots that had seen better years. He had a week's worth of dark stubble on his jaw, and eyes the color of the Colorado sky in October, that particular gray-blue that looks cold until you look long enough to see that it isn't. He was perhaps 29 or 30, she guessed. He carried himself with the easy, unhurried confidence of a man who had nothing to prove and nowhere to be that was more important than where he was right now. He went straight to the counter and spoke to the storekeeper, a short man named Walt, about something to do with fence posts and wire. Maude watched him without meaning to, and then looked away when he glanced in her direction. He didn't look away, though. He looked at her for exactly 1 polite second, touched the brim of his hat in acknowledgement, and then went back to his conversation about fence posts. Maude finished her biscuit, drank her coffee, and left. She spent the afternoon walking the length of the main street, because she was too restless to sit in the small room, and she needed to understand the geography of whatever small trouble she had landed in. She looked into the window of the unnamed saloon and saw that it had a piano battered, shoved against the far wall, one leg shimmed up with a folded piece of leather. She felt something pull in her chest when she saw it, the way a person who loves a thing can't quite look away from it, even in the wrong context. She had been playing piano since she was 7. It was the first thing she had learned before the singing, before the dancing, before the whole bright machinery of the stage. She did not go inside. She went back to the boarding house and ate Ida's supper, which was salt pork and beans and cornbread, plain and honest and genuinely filling, at a long table with 3 other boarders. A land surveyor from Ohio named Gus, a young woman named Pearl who was waiting for her husband to send for her, and an elderly gentleman named Mr. Horatio Fitch, who had been traveling from New Mexico territory to see his daughter in Pueblo and had gotten, he said cheerfully, somewhat delayed. The conversation at supper was pleasant and uncomplicated. Maude learned that Harlan's Creek had been founded 11 years ago as a supply stop along a cattle trail that had since shifted 20 miles north, which explained the town's particular quality of preserved in amber decline. There was no real law to speak of. The sheriff was a man named Grover, who mostly kept the peace through reputation, rather than effort, and was rarely seen before noon. There was a small ranching community around the town, maybe 6 or 7 spreads, and the town survived on their business. The biggest outfit is the Conroy spread, Gus the surveyor said. About 8 miles south, good operation from what I hear. Fellow runs it on his own since his father passed. Conroy, said Mr. Horatio Fitch, chewing thoughtfully. Is that the quiet young man, comes in for supplies Tuesday mornings mostly? That's the one, said Ida from the kitchen doorway. Clyde Conroy, good man. Doesn't make trouble. Maude did not make the connection then. She simply stored the name alongside the rest of the information about Harlan's Creek and went upstairs to read her sister's letter and fall asleep before the candle burned down. She woke to the sound of rain on the window, soft and gray, and she lay in the narrow bed and listened to it and thought about Denver and what waited for her there. The theater, a real stage with proper gas footlights, an audience that had paid to be there. She thought about the feeling of a song filling a large room, the way sound became something physical when it bounced off four walls and came back to you changed. She had been chasing that feeling since she was a girl singing hymns in her father's church in Missouri. She got up, dressed, went down to breakfast, and found that the rain had made everything worse. Amos the driver appeared at the boarding house around 8 in the morning to inform her that the replacement wheel rim had to be sent for from the next town over a settlement called Barlow, 20 miles east, and that he had sent word the previous evening, but it was raining and the road was going to be slow. How long? Maude said, 3 days, maybe 4. 3 days, she repeated with a very controlled and careful voice. I'm sorry, Miss Bishop, nothing to be done about the road. She said nothing for a moment. Then she thanked him, which cost her something, and went back upstairs to sit on the edge of the bed and recalculate. Her contract in Denver was in 8 days. 3 or 4 days here, then however long the road to Denver took, the stage route from Barlow was reliable. Amos had said, perhaps 2 days from there. She could still make it if nothing else went wrong. The trouble with that thought was that things kept going wrong, and had been going wrong for most of her life in small and steady increments, and she had learned to be suspicious of any plan that depended on nothing going wrong. She spent the morning writing a letter to Harold Finch in Denver explaining the delay and assuring him of her imminent arrival, had Walt at the general store post it with the next mail courier, and then stood in the rain outside the store wondering what to do with herself for the next 3 or 4 days. She looked at the unnamed saloon across the street. The rain made the window glass run in silver streaks. She could see the outline of the piano from here. She went inside. The saloon was called, she found out from the barman, a phlegmatic individual named Dutch, the Broken Wheel, which felt pointed under the circumstances. It was mid-morning and only half a dozen men were in residence, nursing drinks with the dedicated patience of men who had nowhere pressing to be. She approached the piano. It was worse up close. 3 keys in the upper register were stuck, and one of the lower strings was badly out of tune. But it was a piano, and she had played worse. She sat down on the bench and played a scale to feel the instrument out, and then, almost without deciding to, she played a melody. Just something light and wandering, a dance tune she had learned years ago from a fiddler in Illinois. She was 3 bars in when she realized the room had gone quiet. She kept playing. The melody moved through its changes, and she let her hands find their own path, adding some ornamentation she had been working on for a new number she was developing for Denver, the kind of thing that sounded improvised but wasn't. The stuck keys in the upper register she simply went around, which made the piece more interesting actually, forced it into unexpected places. When she finished, Dutch said, "Lady, you can play that thing." "Thank you," she said. "We don't have entertainment most weeks," Dutch said. "We had a piano player, but he left in March." "I'm only here 3 or 4 days," Maude said. "We'd pay." She thought about her $11.40. She thought about Denver. She thought about the piano, which despite its missing teeth was a living, breathing instrument that wanted to be played. "How much?" she asked. She was playing that evening. Dutch put up a hand-lettered sign on the door that said musical entertainment tonight, and by 7 o'clock the Broken Wheel had more people in it than it had seen in months, which was to say about 25, which was close to the entire adult population of Harlan's Creek on a rainy Thursday evening. Maude changed into one of her stage dresses, a deep burgundy silk that she had bought second-hand in St. Louis, and altered herself, with a neckline that was respectable for the stage and considerably more striking in a small-town saloon. She did her own hair up, pinned it with the small comb she kept in her dressing kit, and she walked out to the piano at precisely 7 o'clock and sat down and began to play. She played for 2 hours. She sang 12 songs, ballads, dance tunes, a few comic numbers that had the room laughing hard enough that she could feel it physically, a vibration in the floor under her feet. She played with her whole body the way she always did when the music was working, leaning into the phrases, making every person in the room feel like she was playing specifically for them. That was the skill she had spent 10 years developing, that particular quality of intimacy on a stage, the ability to make a performance feel like a conversation. She was in the middle of her 11th song, a slow, aching ballad about a woman waiting for a man to come home from a war that had long since ended, when she noticed the man from the general store. He was standing against the far wall, hat in hand, watching her with those October sky eyes. He had cleaned up, the road dust was gone, the stubble was neatly trimmed, and he was wearing a dark coat over a white shirt. He looked, she thought with some irrelevance, like a man who cleaned up very well indeed. She kept singing. She did not look at him again, but she was aware of him in the particular way performers learn to be aware of the room, not staring, just knowing. When the song ended, the room applauded with genuine warmth, and Dutch pushed a glass of cool water across the top of the piano without being asked, and she drank it and thanked the room for their attention, and said she'd take a short rest before the final few songs. The man from the general store was at her elbow before she had quite registered him approaching. He moved quietly for a big man. "That was something," he said. "The song about the soldier, I didn't know the name of it." "It doesn't have one," Maude said. "I wrote it." He looked at her with a reassessment so slight it would have been invisible to anyone who wasn't paying close attention. "You wrote it 3 years ago, in a coach much like the one that broke down today as it happens." He almost smiled. It was a careful smile, like a man who had learned to be economical with the things he showed. "I'm Clyde Conroy," he said. "Maude Bishop," she said. He extended his hand and she shook it, which wasn't the expected gesture. Most men offered a bow or a nod to a woman in that context, and she liked him immediately for it, the straightforwardness of it. "You're the rancher," she said. "Word travels. Small town." "It is that," he agreed, and glanced around at it with the expression of a man who had made peace with something a long time ago. "What do you raise?" She asked because she was genuinely curious and because she had learned that the fastest way to understand a place was to understand how it made its living. "Cattle, mostly. Some horses. My father started the spread in 1861. I took it over 6 years ago when he passed." He said the last part without flinching, just as information. "On your own." "I have hands, 3 permanent, 2 seasonal." He paused. "You're heading to Denver. Theater contract, 8 days now, assuming the wheel gets fixed." He nodded. "Amos sent word to Barlow this morning. The rim should be here in 2 days, maybe 3. You know Amos." "Everybody knows Amos. He's been driving this route for 15 years. Dutch appeared with a glass of something amber and set it near Clyde's elbow without discussion, the easy familiarity of a man and his regular drink. Clyde picked it up but didn't drink from it immediately, just held it in his large, work-roughened hand and looked at her with an attention that was respectful rather than presumptuous. "You'll play the last few songs?" he asked. "That's what Dutch is paying me for." "Good," he said simply. "I'd like to hear them." She went back to the piano. She played the last 3 songs and saved the best one for last, an up-tempo number that had every boot in the room tapping, and 2 of the older cowboys actually dancing with each other in the small open space near the door, laughing like boys. She played the final notes with a flourish that she had been told was theatrical, and had decided long ago that theatrical was entirely the point. The applause this time was loud and genuine and accompanied by whistling, and Dutch handed her $6 at the end of the evening, which was more than he had promised, and which she accepted with a quiet gratitude she tried not to show too plainly. Clyde Conroy was gone when she looked for him. She noticed his absence the way you notice a familiar piece of furniture, moved a slight displacement in the geography of the room. She walked back to the boarding house in the rain, which had gentled to a mist, and she thought about Denver and the piano and the October sky man who hadn't waited to say goodbye, and she was not sure which of those things was taking up more space in her mind than it ought to. The next morning broke clear and cold, the rain having washed the sky clean to a hard, bright blue. Maude ate breakfast and walked out into a morning that smelled of wet earth and sage, and it was genuinely beautiful in a way she hadn't expected, the light falling flat and gold across the pale dirt of the main street, the hills to the south dark with scrub pine and juniper. She was standing outside the general store when Clyde Conroy rode in from the south. He rode a bay horse, dark and well-built, and he rode the way men who have been on horses their whole lives ride, not performing it, just doing it, the horse and man moving together with no wasted effort. He saw her on the boardwalk and he raised 2 fingers to the brim of his hat. "Morning," he called. "Good morning," she said. He dismounted at the hitching post in front of Walt's store with the ease of someone who has done this 10,000 times, and tied the reins and came up onto the boardwalk. In the morning light she could see that his eyes were in fact closer to blue than gray, with a darker ring at the edge that made them look deep. "Beautiful morning," she said, because it was. "Usually is after rain," he said. "The air has a different quality, I don't know what to call it." "Clarity," she said, "like everything got its face washed." He looked at her and the almost smile came again, more visible this time. "That's a good way to put it." He went into the store for his supplies: flour, coffee, a box of cartridges, a coil of wire, and she found herself following him inside without quite making the decision to do so, and she browsed the notions counter while he spoke to Walt, and when he came back out with his parcels she was somehow there again on the boardwalk as if she had been waiting. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "You can. That building at the end of the street, the one that used to be a church, what is it now?" He looked down the street toward it. "It was a church when my father first came here. Congregation moved on when the cattle trail shifted, the preacher with it. Been empty about 5 years. It's a beautiful building." "It is," he agreed. "Good bones." He looked at her sideways. "You're bored." She opened her mouth to deny it and then laughed instead, a real laugh, the kind that surprised her. "Is it that obvious? You've walked this street 3 times since sunrise. You've been watching." "It's a short street," he said. "Difficult not to notice things." She looked at him and he looked at her, and for a moment the morning just held them both in it. The warm light, and the smell of coffee drifting from somewhere, and the sound of the bay horse shifting his weight at the hitching post. "I was going to ride out to check the southern fence line this morning," Clyde said. "It's not exciting, but the country is good if you've not seen it." "Are you inviting me to inspect a fence line?" "If you'd rather not, I would love to inspect a fence line," Maude said, and was surprised to find that she meant it. Ida Plum was prevailed upon to provide a sensible horse, a small and steady roan mare that had been left by a guest who departed without reclaiming her, and who now lived in the livery and was available to rent. And Maude changed into her traveling skirt, which was divided and practical, and they rode out of Harlan's Creek at 8:30 in the morning, heading south. The country opened up beautifully once they cleared the town. The land rolled in long, shallow waves, golden and gray-green with autumn grass, and the sky above it was that deep, clean blue that the rain had left behind. There were cattle visible in the distance, dark shapes moving slowly across the hills, and the air was so clear she could hear a hawk calling somewhere above her long before she found it with her eyes. Clyde rode beside her at an easy pace and they talked, the way 2 people sometimes talk when they are moving through a beautiful place together, and the movement itself removes whatever usual barriers exist. He told her about his father, a stubborn Irishman from County Galway named Patrick Conroy, who had come west in 1854 with nothing but a bad temper and a good eye for land, and had spent 20 years building something in the Colorado Basin before a hard winter in 1872 took him suddenly. He was 53, Clyde said, strong as a horse until he wasn't. The ranch was heavily in debt when he died. I was 23. Spent 4 years paying it down. It's clear now. That must have been hard, Maude said. It was the work, he said simply. You put your head down and do the work. The land doesn't care about your troubles. You either tend it or you lose it. She told him about her life, the traveling circuit, 3 years of it, town after town across the Middle States. She told him about the theater in Kansas City where she'd gotten her start, about the piano lessons from the German schoolmaster who'd recognized something in her when she was 12 and who had gone home to Germany when she was 15, and who she had never seen since and thought about often. "I got a letter from him once," she said, 3 years ago. "He said he was well and had heard that I was performing on the stage and that he was glad. That was all. That must have meant something. Everything," she said simply. She told him about the contract in Denver, the Golden Palace, Harold Finch, the 6 months that could turn into something real, something permanent, a proper position rather than the endless travel of the circuit. She told it the way she told herself the story, with a forward momentum, like a train already moving. Clyde listened the way good listeners do, completely, without filling the silences, without redirecting to himself, just taking it in. They reached the southern fence line, and he rode it methodically, checking the wire and the posts, stopping twice to make small repairs with tools he carried in his saddlebag. And she held his horse while he worked and watched his hands on the wire and the posts, the confident economy of a man who knew exactly how to do a specific thing and did it without drama. On the way back, they stopped on a low rise and looked out over the basin. You could see for 20 miles in every direction. The afternoon was settling in around them, the light going amber and long, and the cattle in the South Valley were moving toward a water source, a thread of silver in the middle distance. "Do you like it?" asked. "The ranching life." He thought about it seriously, which she had already noticed was what he did with questions treated them as worth answering properly. "I like the land," he said. "I like knowing what the weather is going to do before it does it. I like the horses." He paused. "I'm not sure I chose it exactly. It was there and I was able to do it, but I don't regret it. That's not the same as loving it." "No," he agreed. "It's not." He looked at her. "What about you? Do you love it?" "The stage. I love the music," she said. "The performing it's something I'm good at. But the love is for the music. The stage is just where the music lives for me." "You could make music live somewhere else," he said, and the observation was so simple and so without agenda that it landed differently than it would have coming from someone trying to make a point. He was just thinking out loud, the way a man does when he's genuinely interested in how something works. "Possibly," Maude said, and looked out at the long gold and gray country. They rode back to Harlan's Creek in the late afternoon, and she was warm and dusty, and had mud on her traveling skirt from a creek crossing, and she felt better than she had felt in longer than she could precisely remember. He left her at the boarding house door with a brief touch to the brim of his hat and a quiet "Good evening, Miss Bishop," and rode off down the street toward the livery and whatever came after for him, and she stood on the boarding house step watching him go with an expression she was glad there was no one to witness. She played at the broken wheel again that evening. Dutch had spread the word, and the crowd was larger. People from the ranching outfits nearby had come in, drawn by the news of a real musician, and the room was warm and full, and she played harder for it, gave them everything she had. She played new things she had been working on and old things that the older people in the room seemed to recognize, and at one point a man produced a fiddle from somewhere and joined her, and they played a long set of dance music together while the floor cleared and people danced with genuine and uncomplicated joy. Clyde was there again. He sat at the same spot along the far wall, and he listened with the same complete and steady attention. And when she caught his eye once across the warm, noisy room, he raised his glass in a small acknowledgement that she felt somewhere in the middle of her chest. After, when the crowd had thinned and Dutch was cleaning the bar, Clyde brought her a glass of water and sat across from her at the small table nearest the piano, and they talked until Dutch started blowing out lamps. They talked about books. He had a small collection, mostly history and the occasional novel that came through on the mail coach, and he read everything. She had read voraciously since childhood, everything she could get her hands on, and she found that they had both read the same Harper's new monthly articles about the Reconstruction and had thoughts about them that were worth the exchange. They talked about the political situation, the end of the frontier territories, the railways coming through, and what that would mean for towns like Harlan's Creek. "The railway will either save this town or kill it," Clyde said. "Depends entirely on whether the line comes through or goes around." "What do you think it'll do?" He looked at the bare walls of the saloon with their smoke-darkened planks. "Go around. This basin doesn't offer the grade they want. They'll go through Barlow. What happens to the town then?" "It either finds something else to be, or it doesn't." He said it without sentimentality, just fact. "Does that worry you? The ranch is tied to this town." "I've thought about it," he said. "But the land doesn't change because a rail line doesn't go through it. I'll adapt. I always have." She looked at him in the dying lamplight and thought that she believed him entirely. The next day she found out the wheel rim was coming from Barlow and would arrive the following morning. 2 more days then. She should have felt relief, and she did, genuinely. Denver was still reachable. The contract was safe. Her life was on schedule. But she also felt something else, a small, quiet thing she chose not to look at directly. She and Clyde had breakfast at the boarding house. He had business in town that day and had accepted Ida's standing invitation to boarders' meals at a quarter per sitting. And after breakfast, they walked to the end of the street to look at the old church building, which Maude had mentioned again the evening before. Up close it was even more striking. It had been built of stone, not wood, which was unusual for this part of the territory, and which accounted for its good condition after 5 years of vacancy. It had a square bell tower, the bell long since taken somewhere else, and tall, narrow windows and double doors of heavy oak that had weathered to a deep silver gray. Clyde produced a key from his coat pocket. "You have a key," Maude said. "The building belongs to the town. I've been on the town council since 1875. We talk about what to do with it every spring and decide nothing every spring." He opened the doors and they went inside. The interior was large and cool, lit by the morning light coming through those tall windows in long angled bars. The pews were still in place, rough-hewn pine benches arranged in rows down the central aisle, the wood dry and silvered but solid. At the front where the altar had been, there was an empty space with a low platform. The floor was stone, like the walls, and their footsteps echoed. Maude walked to the front and stood on the low platform and looked back down the empty pews and the long aisle to the open doors at the back, where the morning light poured in. "This would be a magnificent theater," she said softly. Clyde stood at the back, hands in his coat pockets, watching her. "The acoustics are good," he said. "I remember that from when services were held." She sang one note, just middle C, her testing note, the one she always used to feel a room. It resonated beautifully, clean and round, filling the stone space and returning to her from every surface. And she felt it in her sternum, that full-room physical vibration she had been chasing her whole life. She turned and looked at Clyde Conroy standing at the back of the old church in the morning light, and she thought, there it is, not the theater, not Denver, something else, and she was not ready to name it. She said, "The people in this town deserve something like this." "They do," he agreed. "The piano and the broken wheel would sound extraordinary in here." "It would." "Someone should do something with this building," she said firmly. "Someone should," he said, and he was smiling now, the real smile, not the careful almost version, and it changed his face entirely, made him younger, made him warmer, made her want to make him do it again. She came back down the aisle toward him and stopped when she was close enough that she could see the particular blue-gray of his eyes, and she said, without quite planning to say it, "I think you're a good man, Clyde Conroy." He looked at her for a moment without speaking, with that characteristic thoroughness. "I try to be," he said. "I don't always manage." "Who does?" she said. They stood in the quiet of the old church, morning light falling around them in those long diagonal bars, and neither of them moved for what felt like a long time. That afternoon, Clyde had to ride back to his ranch. He had responsibilities that had already been delayed by the extra day in town. He came to say goodbye to her at the boarding house at 2 o'clock, hat in hand, and she stood on the front step looking up at him. "Your rim should be here tomorrow morning," he said. Amos will have you on the road by noon, I'd think." "Yes," she said. "Denver's a good city," he said. "Good opportunities for someone with your talent." "That's what Harold Finch says." A beat. "Is Harold Finch a friend?" "A theater manager," she said. "I've never met him. He saw me perform in Kansas City 8 months ago and sent a letter." Something in Clyde's expression shifted in a very small way that she filed away. "Well," he said, "the Golden Palace is a real theater. You'll do well there." "I expect I will," she said, and hated the brittleness in her own voice. He put his hat on. He extended his hand again as he had in the saloon that first evening, that honest, pragmatic handshake that she had liked so much. She took it and he held her hand for a second longer than a simple handshake required, and she felt every beat of that second. "It was a pleasure, Miss Bishop," he said. "Maude," she said. He looked at her. "Maude," he said, and it was strange how much of a person could be in how they said your name. He mounted up and rode south out of town, and she stood on the boarding house step and watched the road long after the dust had settled. At supper she was quiet, and Ida looked at her with the shrewd kindness of a woman who had seen many things. "Clyde Conroy's a good man," Ida said without preamble. "So everyone says," Maude said. "He's also lonely," Ida said. "Has been since his father died. He pours himself into that land, and that's fine. Land is worth pouring yourself into, but a person needs more than land eventually." Maude said nothing. "Not that it's any of my business," Ida said serenely, and took the plates away. Maude went to the Broken Wheel and played for 2 hours that evening, but her heart wasn't in it the same way, and she knew the room could feel it. The music was technically fine, but it didn't have the charge it had had the 2 previous nights, and she knew why, and it made her annoyed with herself. She walked back to the boarding house at 9 o'clock. The night was very clear, the stars hard and bright at altitude, the kind of sky that made you feel small and briefly honest. She stood outside the boarding house looking up at it. She thought about the theater in Denver. She thought about 6 months on a proper stage with gas footlights and a full house and the music rising into proper acoustics. She thought about a stone church building and the note she had sung and how it had come back to her from every wall. She thought about gray-blue October eyes and a hand held for 1 beat longer than necessary. She went to bed. She did not sleep easily. The wheel rim arrived the next morning on the mail rider from Barlow at 9:30, and by 11 o'clock Amos had it fitted and the coach was ready, and Maude's trunk was loaded and her hatbox was secured, and there was no earthly reason not to get into the coach. She stood beside the coach door for a long moment. Ida Plum stood in the doorway of the boarding house with her arms crossed over her chest and an expression of complete non-judgment. Pearl, the young woman waiting for her husband to send for her, came out of the boarding house and hugged Maude goodbye, which surprised them both. Mr. Horatio Fitch shook her hand warmly and wished her the best of luck, and said that he had never heard a woman play piano quite like that, and expected he never would again. Amos waited on the driver's box with the patience of a man who had driven coaches for 30 years, and had learned that people took their time at departure when they needed to. Maude looked south on the main street. The road went out of town to the south and then curved west toward the route that would eventually connect to the Barlow Road and thence to Denver. There was nothing on the south road, just dust and distance and the hills going silver-green in the late morning light. She got into the coach. Amos clicked the horses forward and the wheels began to turn, and Harlan's Creek started to move past the window frame, the general store, the barber shop, the Broken Wheel with its crooked piano, the old stone church at the end of the street with its silver-gray doors. The coach cleared the edge of town and the road opened up and the sky opened up, and Denver was 6 days away and the Golden Palace Theater was waiting for her, and she had worked for years for exactly this. She said, "Amos, stop the coach." Amos stopped the coach. She sat there for 10 seconds. She thought about Harold Finch's letter. She thought about the contract in her inner pocket. She thought about the German schoolmaster who had written to say he was glad she was on the stage. She got out of the coach. "I'm sorry," she said to Amos. I'll need the next coach whenever that comes through." Amos looked at her without particular surprise. 3 days, he said. Next one comes through Friday. I'll take Friday's coach. Amos shrugged with his characteristic vast indifference to the dramatic decisions of the people he transported, and he clicked the horses forward again, and the coach went on without her, and she stood on the road outside Harlan's Creek with her trunk at her feet and her hatbox in her hand, and the sun falling on the top of her head. She was not entirely sure what she was doing. She picked up her trunk and her hatbox and walked back into Harlan's Creek. Ida Plum was still in the boarding house doorway. She looked at Maude for a long moment. 2 more nights, she said. 2 more nights, Maude said. Ida stepped aside to let her back in. I'll keep the room, she said. I hadn't changed the linen anyway. Maude put her trunk back in the room and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at her hands. She had to write to Harold Finch again. She would need to explain another delay. She would still make the contract date if she left Friday barely, but she would make it. She wrote the letter. She had Walt post it. And then she did the thing she had been circling for 3 days. She went to the livery and rented the roan mare, and she rode south. She knew the ranch was 8 miles south of town. She had ridden part of the way 2 days ago. She knew the fence line, and she knew the direction, and she rode with purpose, the way she did things when she had decided to do them, without the second-guessing that had plagued her on the road. She found the ranch house at noon. It was a solid, practical house, stone on the lower half and timber on the upper, with a covered porch that ran the width of the front face and a garden to one side that had been productive in the summer and was now going dormant in the autumn. There were 3 outbuildings, all in good repair, and a large corral where 3 horses stood in the sun. Somewhere behind the house she could hear the sound of hammering. She rode around to the back and found Clyde Conroy on a ladder, repairing the roof of one of the outbuildings with one of his ranch hands, a young man of perhaps 20 named Tomas passing materials up to him. Clyde heard the horse and looked down from the ladder, and he saw her, and he was very still for a moment. "Miss Bishop," he said. "Maude," she said. "Maude," he looked at her. "The coach left this morning." "It did," she said. "I got out." He climbed down from the ladder. He was in work clothes, the worn shirt, no coat, his hat pushed back, and there was sawdust in his dark hair, and he looked, she thought, absolutely himself. Just entirely and completely who he was, with nothing performed about it. "Why?" he said. She had rehearsed several versions of the answer on the road. They all seemed insufficient now, standing in front of him with the autumn sun warm on her back. "Because I sang one note in that church building and it felt like everything I've been looking for," she said. "And because I think you know it did. And because I don't want to wonder in 6 months what would have happened if I had turned around." She paused. "And because when you said my name yesterday, it went somewhere I can't ignore." He looked at her for a long time. The young man Tomas was very carefully not looking at either of them. "You have a contract in Denver," Clyde said. "I have a contract in Denver that I can still make if I leave Friday. And after 6 months the contract is up and I make another decision," she said. "But first I need to know if there's a decision to be made." He took off his hat. He ran his hand through his sawdust-covered hair. He looked at the corral and then at the house and then at her. "There's a decision to be made," he said. The 3 days before Friday's coach were something she would remember for the rest of her life, with a clarity that didn't soften with time. They rode together in the mornings. He showed her the full spread, the southern pastures and the creek that ran through the property's eastern edge, the high ground to the west where you could see 3 mountain peaks on a clear day. He talked about the land with a love that he hadn't used the word love for, but which was plainly that. The way a person talks about the things they tend and know and belong to. She played piano at the Broken Wheel in the evenings, and he was there, sitting against the far wall. But now when she caught his eye across the warm room, the acknowledgement was different, fuller, more certain, like 2 people who have agreed on something. On Thursday evening, the night before she was to leave, they sat on the porch of the boarding house after supper because the night was fine and still, the stars extraordinary, and they had run out of interest in being indoors. Ida brought them both coffee without being asked and went back inside with the tact of a woman who understood occasions. "I'll write to you," Maude said, "if you're willing." "I'm willing," he said, "and I'll come back in 6 months, if you'll let me." He looked at her in the darkness with those deep October eyes. "Maude," he said, with a patience that was not impatience, "there is no question of letting you. You go do what you worked for. And then you come back if you want to. And if you come back, I will be here." "You might have changed your mind in 6 months," she said. "I might," he agreed honestly. "But I doubt it." She reached across the space between them and took his hand, which was large and warm and calloused from the work, and he laced his fingers through hers, and they sat like that for a long time looking at the stars while somewhere down the street someone in the broken wheel tried to play the piano and made a respectable attempt of it. He kissed her when he walked her to the coach Friday morning. It was the first time she had half expected it at the church, or on the evening of the ride to the fence line, but he had been patient and careful with her, which she had appreciated even as part of her had wanted to shake him by the shoulders. He kissed her in the thin early light with the horses stomping and the coach waiting and Amos looking at the horizon with professional detachment, and it was the kind of kiss that made a promise without needing words to do it. 6 months, she said. 6 months, he said. She got into the coach. The coach left Harlan's Creek heading north toward Barlow, and she looked out the window until the town was gone, and then she faced forward and thought about Denver. Denver was everything she had imagined and also more exhausting than she had imagined, which was the nature of things. The Golden Palace Theater was real and glorious, a proper gaslit stage with deep burgundy curtains, and a house that seated 350. Harold Finch was a compact, energetic man of 50 with a handlebar mustache, and a genuine if businesslike appreciation for talent. He was pleased with her and showed it in the practical way of theater managers, by giving her good material and scheduling her prominently. She performed 6 nights a week for 6 months. She sang 12 numbers a show, played piano for 4 of them, danced in 2 group numbers, and headlined 3 times a week above the other acts. Denver loved her. The reviews in the Rocky Mountain News were good. One critic called her a talent of rare and natural authority, and she had cut the review out and kept it, because her mother had always said to keep the good reviews. She wrote to Clyde Conroy every week. She told him about the theater, about the audience, about the specific feel of 350 people responding to the music. She told him about Denver itself, the new buildings going up, the railway terminus, the energy of a city still deciding what it was. She told him small things, the kind of things that accumulate into a life. The Chinese restaurant she had discovered 2 blocks from the theater, the bookseller on Larimer Street who kept a remarkable stock, the family of sparrows that had nested in the gutter outside her boarding room window. He wrote back with the same frequency. His letters were not long, but they were precise. He told her about the ranch in the autumn and winter, the preparations for cold weather, the cattle's movements, the first snow coming off the mountains in October. He told her about Harlan's Creek, small news of the town that arrived with the warmth of being from a specific place. He told her that Dutch had found a piano player, a 17-year-old boy named Will from a homestead family nearby, who had more enthusiasm than skill but was improving, and that the broken wheel was livelier for it. He told her that he had gone back to the old church building and stood in it for a while and thought about what she had said. He told her that he had brought the matter to the town council with more force than he'd previously applied, and that there had been a serious discussion about restoring the building for community use. He told her that the town had voted to do it, and that the restoration had begun in November with the labor donated by half a dozen ranching families, and that it would be ready by spring. She read that letter 3 times and then wrote him back and told him he was a wonderful man, and he wrote back and said he had simply repeated what she'd said. In February, in the middle of a Colorado winter that was producing quantities of snow that made Denver feel like the inside of a cloud, Harold Finch offered her an extension. Another 6 months. Same terms, better billing, her name at the top, above the title, the thing she had been working toward for a decade. She stood in his office with the offer in front of her, and she looked at it for a long time. She thought about the gaslit stage and 350 people. She thought about her name at the top of the bill. She thought about a stone church with good acoustics and the way a single note could fill a room. She thought about Clyde Conroy and the way he had written in his most recent letter that February was the hardest month on a ranch, cold and dark and relentless, but that the sky was extraordinary, the stars sharper in the cold, and he had been spending his evenings reading, and he had reread the novel she had recommended, a particular Dickens. And she had been right. It was better the second time. She declined Harold Finch's extension. She thanked him genuinely and warmly, and she meant every word of the thanks. She had needed this, all of it. The gaslit stage, the full house, the name at the top. She had needed to know she could do it completely without compromise. She had done it. Completely, without compromise. And now she knew something else she needed, and it was waiting for her 8 miles south of Harlan's Creek. She was on the westbound coach 10 days after the contract ended, having written to Clyde Conroy a letter that simply said, "I am coming back. I will be in Harlan's Creek on the 17th of March if the roads are clear. I hope the roads are clear." The roads were clear. She arrived in Harlan's Creek on the 17th of March, 1879, at 2 in the afternoon, and Clyde Conroy was standing outside the boarding house when the coach came in. He looked exactly as she remembered him, and also more, somehow. The 6 months had resolved him in her mind from a vivid impression into a complete person, and seeing him again was the strange double sensation of recognition and discovery at once. He was wearing his dark coat, and his hat was in his hand, and he was watching the coach with an expression that was not quite composure. She stepped down from the coach and stood on the street in Harlan's Creek and looked at him. "I was not sure about the roads," he said. "They were fine," she said. "Amos sends his regards." He smiled, the real smile, the full one, the one that changed his face entirely. And he crossed the distance between them in 3 strides, and she took 2 steps to meet him. And then he had his arms around her in the middle of the Harlan's Creek Main Street in the middle of the afternoon, with Ida Plum watching openly from the boarding house doorway, and Dutch watching from the broken wheel window, and Walt watching from the general store. And he held her like a man who had been patient for a long time, and had earned the right to stop being patient. She put her face against his shoulder and felt the solid, real warmth of him, and thought, yes, this was the decision. That evening he took her to the old church. The restoration was complete. The exterior had been repaired where the mortar had crumbled between the stones, the windows reglazed, the great oak doors refinished. Inside, the pews had been sanded smooth, and the platform at the front extended and leveled. There were oil lamps along the walls in brackets, a dozen of them, and the stone floor had been swept and scrubbed until it showed its original warm color, a pale amber sandstone that she hadn't been able to see through the years of dust. At the front of the platform, in the center, sat the piano from the broken wheel. "Dutch sold it to the town," Clyde said. "He said it belonged in a bigger room." Maude walked to it slowly. She ran her hand along the top of the case. The stuck keys in the upper register had been fixed. She pressed them and they moved smoothly, and when she played a test chord the tuning was better, not perfect, but significantly better. Someone had worked on it. "Who tuned it?" she asked. "There's an instrument man in Barlow. He came out special." She sat down on the bench. The room was lit with the amber lamplight and smelled of new wood and linseed oil and something that might have been hope. The high windows were dark with the evening outside, but the lamplight made the stone walls glow. She played the same note she had played 8 months ago, middle C, her testing note. It rang out and filled the room and came back from every wall and from the vaulted ceiling and washed over her like warm water, full and round and resonant and right. She played the song she had written in a coach 3 years ago, the one without a name, The one about the woman waiting for a man to come home from a war that had already ended. And in the lamplight with the empty pews and Clyde Conroy standing at the back of the room, she played it differently than she ever had before, slower, more deliberate, letting each phrase breathe fully before moving to the next. The way you play something when you are not performing it but living it. When she finished there was silence, good silence, the kind a room holds when something has been said truly. Clyde walked down the aisle from the back of the room, and he sat in the front pew and looked at her. "That song should have a name," he said. "What would you call it?" she asked. He thought about it with his characteristic honesty. "I'd call it Right Place," he said, "because that's what it sounds like someone finding the right place." She looked at him for a long moment. "Right Place," she said. "Yes." She played the first phrase again just to hear it with the name attached to it, and it fit perfectly. "I want to ask you something," Clyde said. "Ask it," she said. "I know you came back to see what this was," he said carefully. "Between us. And I know you have a life that isn't here, a career, choices. I'm not asking you to trade one for the other. I don't think that's what this is about." He paused. "But I want to know if there's a possibility that this town and this building and what you could build here, if there's a possibility you could be here, not instead of the life you've built, but as part of it." She turned on the piano bench to face him fully. "Are you asking me to stay?" she said. "I'm asking if you want to," he said with the same precision he gave to everything. "Because there's a difference, and I won't ask you to do anything you don't want." Maude Bishop looked at the restored church with its amber lamplight, and its excellent acoustics, and its tuned piano. She looked at the man sitting in the front pew of it with his hat on his knee and his gray-blue October eyes and his whole honest face. "I want to," she said, "but I also want to keep performing, not on the circuit, not 6 nights a week in Denver, but here in this building for this community, and maybe occasional engagements, real ones when they come. I won't pretend I don't need an audience." "I know you do," he said. "That's part of you. And you're all right with that." He stood up from the pew. He was very close now. "Maude," he said, "I fell in love with you when you were performing. Asking you to stop would be like asking the river to stop running so the land could be dry. It would be the wrong thing, and it would ruin both." She stood up from the bench. They were eye-level close enough that she could see the texture of his expression, every line of the face she had been carrying in her mind for 6 months. "You said you fell in love with me," she said. "I did," he said. "In March of last year in this very building when you sang one note and turned around and looked at me like you'd found something. I fell in love with you then. I've had 6 months to determine if it was sound, and it is." She took his face in both her hands, which surprised him, which she could see in the brief widening of those eyes. And she kissed him there in the lamplight of the old restored church. And he kissed her back with all the patience he had been exercising for 6 months, finally, completely, released. They were married in June of 1879 in the church that had been restored, which felt exactly right, with Ida Plum in the front row crying quietly and Dutch from the broken wheel in the second row looking profoundly pleased with himself for having sold the piano, and the surveyor Gus, who happened to be passing through again on another commission, and who showed up to the ceremony with a bottle of good whiskey and a cheerful disregard for the coincidence. Pearl was there too, having been sent for by her husband 2 months after Maude's departure. She had settled 20 miles north and had driven down with her husband specifically for the occasion, which moved Maude more than she expected. Tomas, the young ranch hand, stood up with Clyde. A woman named Margaret Sayers from the neighboring ranch, who had become Maude's closest friend in the 3 months since her return, stood with Maude. The ceremony was performed by a circuit preacher named Reverend Cole, who came through the basin every 6 weeks, and who had a good solid voice and kind eyes, and who, when Maude sang during the ceremony, she had insisted on this, had chosen a hymn she had sung as a girl in her father's Missouri church, stood at the side of the platform with an expression of pure gratitude. After the ceremony, there was a celebration in the church hall that lasted well into the night. Maude played, and Will the 17-year-old piano enthusiast played, and the fiddle man from the cattle ranch to the east played, and the people of Harlan's Creek and the surrounding ranches danced on the amber sandstone floor until their boots were dusty and their faces were flushed, and the night was late and good. Clyde danced twice, which was apparently a remarkable feat for a man who did not, as several people informed her with great affection, dance. He danced with her, and he danced with Ida Plum, and he danced badly and cheerfully, and she loved him very much. That first year of marriage was the year that Harlan's Creek changed, or more precisely began the change that would take a decade to complete but whose beginning was visible and felt. The restored church-turned-community hall was the center of it. Maude organized monthly musical evenings, proper performances open to everyone in the basin, and they drew people from 20 miles around. She wrote to musicians she had known on the circuit, and some of them came through to perform, giving Harlan's Creek an occasional quality of genuine cultural life that it had not expected to possess. She organized a music school. It was informal at first, 3 children from the town on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons, learning to read music and play the repaired piano, but it grew. By the end of the first year there were 11 students. Maude taught them with the same absolute seriousness with which the German schoolmaster had taught her, because she knew from experience what that kind of attention could do to a young person's life. She took 2 engagements in Denver that first year, a week each, both booked through Harold Finch, who bore no grudge about the extension she had declined, and who was in fact pleased to have her back on a selective basis, which turned out to suit both of them considerably better than the original arrangement. She traveled with the specific lightness of a person who knows where home is, which makes all traveling easier. She performed at the Golden Palace, and the audiences were as good as they had always been, and she gave them everything she had, and then she came home to Harlan's Creek and to Clyde. Coming home the first time after the first Denver engagement was a thing she had not fully prepared for the specific particular joy of it. The coach coming into the basin in the late afternoon with the hills going rose and amber in the autumn light, and the familiar short Main Street coming into view, and the stone church with its new clean windows, and the boarding house where she had spent her first uncertain nights. She was not a boarder anymore. She was a resident. She was home. Clyde met her at the coaching stop. He had her in his arms before she had quite finished stepping down from the vehicle, and she laughed into his shoulder and held him and thought that she would never again underestimate the value of a place that was specifically yours with a person who was specifically yours in it. Their son was born in the spring of 1881. They named him Patrick, for Clyde's father, and he arrived into the world with a full head of dark hair and his father's October sky eyes, and an opinion about most things that he expressed with great volume and no ambiguity, which Clyde said was entirely from her side of the family, and which Maude said was convenient revisionism. Patrick Conroy was a vigorous and cheerful child who showed an early interest in horses, which delighted his father, and an early interest in the piano, which delighted his mother, and who spent his first 2 years conducting a thorough investigation of every corner of the ranch house and everything it contained. Clyde's 3 ranch hands regarded the boy with the particular helpless affection of men who are not accustomed to small people and have been entirely undone by one. Tomas, now 22 and still at the Conroy Ranch, made Patrick a small wooden horse that was so carefully constructed it could stand on its own, and Patrick carried it everywhere for 2 years until it finally fell apart, and Maude kept the pieces in a small box because she was that kind of mother. The Harlan's Creek that existed in 1883 was genuinely different from the one she had stepped out of a broken-wheeled coach into 5 years earlier. The railway had gone through Barlow as Clyde had predicted, and Barlow had grown substantially as a result, but the expected death of Harlan's Creek had not materialized. Instead, the town had found something else to be a community center for the ranching basin, distinguished by its musical and cultural life in a way that was genuinely unusual for its size. People came from Barlow and beyond for the monthly performances. Several families had settled in the area specifically because of the school, which now included Maude's music program as well as reading and arithmetic instruction. There were ongoing injustices in the territory that touched the lives of the people around them in ways that Maude and Clyde could not ignore and did not try to. The treatment of the native peoples of Colorado, the dispossession of the land that had accelerated since the end of the Indian Wars, sat heavily on any honest person who looked at it directly. The Conroy Ranch sat on land that had belonged, not many decades ago, to the Ute people, and Clyde spoke about this without evasion when the subject arose, which it did when a Ute family came through the basin in the autumn of 1882, displaced from their traditional grounds to a reservation further west. He gave them what help he could supplies, grazing for their horses for 2 nights, directions to the nearest settlement where they had connections. And Maude watched him do it with a quiet helplessness at the limits of what one person could offer against the scale of what had been done. They talked about it afterward, and they talked about it honestly, without wrapping it in comfortable language, because Maude had been raised by a woman who believed that looking at difficult things directly was the minimum required of a decent person. In 1884, Maude was offered something she had not anticipated, a position in Denver not as a performer, but as the director of musical programming for the newly established Denver Civic Concert Society. It was an organizational and curatorial role, choosing performers, building programs, working with patrons to fund it, and it would require her presence in Denver for perhaps 2 weeks a month, with flexibility around the ranch's busy seasons. She sat with this for a week before she talked to Clyde about it. She turned it over from every angle, the way she did with big things, examining it for what it was and what it wasn't. When she told him, he listened with his characteristic completeness, and then he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Is it something you want?" "It's something I'm good at," she said. "Curating, building programs. I've been doing it here for 5 years." "That's not what I asked." She looked at him. "Yes," she said. "It is something I want. It's the next version of what I've been building." "Then you should do it," he said simply. 2 weeks a month in Denver. "Patrick and I will manage," he said. He looked at her with the steady love that had not changed in quality in 5 years, only deepened, accumulated interest like a good account. "Maude, I have never asked you to be smaller than you are. I'm not starting now." She took the position. She was exceptional at it. She had an instinct for programs that moved people, and a talent for the organizational demands of the role that she hadn't known she possessed until she needed it. The Denver Civic Concert Society grew in its first 3 years from a modest local enterprise to something with genuine regional reputation, and the reviews in the Rocky Mountain News were consistent and warm. She was on the stage in Denver 2 or 3 times a year herself, because she missed it, and because the audience still responded to her with the same warmth, and she was not ready to give up the conversation of performance entirely. But the programming work was the larger part of it, and it satisfied something in her that pure performing had always left slightly incomplete. The desire not just to be the music, but to be the person who made space for the music to exist. She came home to Harlan's Creek always. To the ranch and the stone house and the horses in the corral, and Clyde's hands and Patrick's endless running commentaries on the natural world, and the excellent acoustics of the old church, where she still taught, where the enthusiastic piano student had grown into a genuinely accomplished musician of 23 who now led the monthly evenings with real authority. Their daughter arrived in 1886. They named her Cecily, for Maude's mother, and she came into the world with more tranquility than her brother had demonstrated, and looked about the room with an expression of calm assessment that Clyde said was entirely her mother, and which Maude took as the compliment it was intended to be. Patrick, at 5, received his sister with a combination of suspicion and protectiveness that was endearing, and that resolved, within 6 months, into a devoted older sibling relationship that would only grow more solid with time. He showed her everything: the wooden horse, the barn cats. his particular favorite spot on the west fence where you could see the mountains. And she received all of it with that calm, assessing gaze that suggested she was taking careful note. The Conroy Ranch in the autumn of 1887 was a thriving operation. Clyde had expanded carefully over the years, not ambitiously, but intelligently, adding acreage when the opportunity was sound and the finances were clear. He had 4 permanent hands now, including Tomas, who had stayed with remarkable loyalty, and who had, 3 years ago, married a woman named Rosa from a Mexican family settled near Barlow, and who had become part of the extended life of the ranch in a way that was purely good. Clyde was 38 years old, with gray at his temples and the beginning of sun lines at the corners of his eyes, and he was the most settled and certain person Maude had ever known, in the sense of being exactly who he was in every context, in town or at work, or in the lamplight of their kitchen, with the children loud around him. She loved him with the particular depth that comes from 8 years of daily accumulation, the ordinary and the extraordinary layered together until they can't be separated. She was 35, and she had gray at her own temples now that she neither masked nor drew attention to, and she had written 14 more songs since the nameless one, all of which had names, and one of which, a gentle, lilting thing she had written the winter Patrick was born, had been picked up by a Chicago music publisher and printed as sheet music, which meant that somewhere in parlors she would never visit, people were playing her music, and that thought made her very happy. She played right place. That was still what she called it, what Clyde had called it in the lamplight a lifetime ago, at every performance she gave. It was her closing number always. It had become known as her signature, the piece people waited for, and she played it each time as if it were new, which was possible because she had never stopped finding new things in it. On the evening of their 8th wedding anniversary in June of 1887, Clyde took her to the church after supper while Ida Plum, still living, still sharp, retired from the boarding house but unstoppable in her general presence in town life, watched the children. The church was quiet and empty in the summer evening, the long light still coming through the high windows in gold bars that fell across the pews and the amber stone floor. Maude sat at the piano. She played right place. She played it slowly and fully, all the way through without stopping, and Clyde sat in the front pew where he had sat 8 years ago and listened to every note. When she finished, the church held its good silence. 8 years, he said. 8 years, she said. Are you happy? He asked, and it was not a question born of doubt but of the desire to hear it, the way a person who loves a thing needs to hear the thing confirmed. She turned on the bench to look at him. The evening light was warm on his face, and his gray-blue eyes were watching her with all the patient love she had come to depend on as absolutely as she depended on the ground under her feet. "Clyde Conroy," she said. "I got off a broken stagecoach in the worst town I had ever seen, and I was furious, and I had a contract waiting for me, and I knew exactly who I was and where I was going." She paused. "And in 4 days in this specific wrong town, I found everything I was actually looking for. Yes. I am happy. I am happier than I thought a person was supposed to be." He looked at her for a long moment, and then he stood from the pew and came to the piano, and she slid over on the bench and he sat beside her, which surprised a laugh out of her because he was not a piano player and had never claimed to be. He put his right hand on the keys and with one finger, slowly and inaccurately, picked out the opening phrase of "right place." He had been listening to it for 8 years. He knew where it went. She watched him do it, and she felt something so complete and so full that there was no adequate language for it. She put her hands over his, large and capable, and played the phrase properly, guiding his fingers through it. And the old piano in the amber lamplight of the old stone church filled the room with the sound of a piece of music that had been written in a stagecoach by a woman who was going to the wrong place, and that had been named by a man who had known, when he heard it, that someone had found the right one. Outside, Harlan's Creek was doing what small towns do in the long summer evening. A few people on the main street. the smell of supper from the boarding house, where Ida was currently managing Patrick, and Cecily with the implacable efficiency of a woman who had managed many things. The sound of a fiddle from somewhere down the street, where Will was apparently having a musical evening of his own at the community hall, the horses in the livery settling for the night. The great empty Colorado sky going rose and gold over all of it. It was not Denver. It was not the Golden Palace with its gaslit stage and its 350 seats. It was a town of perhaps 80 people in a high basin in southeastern Colorado in the year of our Lord 1887, and it was exactly the right place, and she had arrived in it by accident, and she had stayed by choice, and she would not have traded any of it for anything the wider world had on offer. Clyde's finger found the last note of the phrase and landed on it correctly, and she felt him laugh beside her, quiet and warm, that rare and genuine laugh that she had been collecting like a person collects rare things, each one precious. "Maybe," she said, echoing a thought that had lived in her chest since the beginning of it all, the wrong town was exactly the right one. He turned and looked at her and smiled the full real smile that changed his face and said everything. "Maybe," he said, "it always was." And in the long gold evening, in the right place with the right person and the music still ringing from the stone walls, Maude Bishop Maude Conroy played the last note of the song and let it fill the room and breathed it in and was entirely, completely, and finally home.